The spreadsheet was still open on her laptop when they told her she no longer had a job. Wren Halsey did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying in front of people who had already decided you were disposable was just giving them something else to take from you. So she closed the laptop, slowly, deliberately, the way you close a door on something you will never open again. And she picked up her bag, and she walked out of the Mercer Financial offices on Bay Street without saying a single word to anyone. It was February in Toronto, the kind of February that makes you question every decision that led you to still be living here. The wind came off the lake like it had a grudge, and Wren stood on the sidewalk outside the glass tower where she had spent 4 years of her life, and felt the cold move straight through her coat like she was made of nothing. 4 years. She had given that place 4 years of her life. She had come in early and stayed late. She had caught errors in quarterly reports that would have cost clients hundreds of thousands of dollars. She had trained 3 junior analysts who all got promoted before she did, and she had smiled through every single one of their celebration lunches and told herself her turn was coming. It never came. What came instead was a Tuesday afternoon meeting with HR and a printout of an internal restructuring memo, and a woman named Barb who kept calling her Hon, and slid a manila envelope across the table like she was doing Wren a favor. 3 weeks severance. After 4 years. Wren walked to the subway and got on the train and stood in the car pressed between strangers and stared at her own reflection in the dark window and thought, I am 31 years old. I have $1,100 in my bank account. My landlord raised the rent in January, and the only person who would notice if I disappeared right now is my cat. The cat's name was Revenue. She had named him that as a joke when she got him, during a period in her life when she still made jokes. She got off at Ossington and walked the 4 blocks to her apartment building. The kind of building where the buzzard had been broken for 8 months, and the super kept telling her it was on the list. And she climbed the stairs because the elevator had a smell she had never been able to identify and did not want to, and she unlocked her door, and Revenue came to meet her at the entrance with the total indifference of a creature who knew exactly how much he was loved, and had decided not to give anything back about it. She sat down on the floor beside him. The envelope from Barb was still in her bag. She had not opened it. She sat there for a long time. The call came at 9 the next morning. Wren was still in bed, which was something she almost never was at 9 in the morning, and for a moment she didn't recognize the number and almost didn't pick up. It was a local number, but not one saved in her phone. She picked up on the 4th ring. Miss Halsey. Not a question. A man's voice, low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had apparently never needed to rush anything in its life. My name is Aldrich Vane. I understand you were recently let go from Mercer Financial. She sat up. Who told you that? I have good sources. A pause. Not uncomfortable. He seemed entirely comfortable with silence, which immediately made her uncomfortable. I have a position I'd like to discuss with you. In person, if you're available. What kind of position? The kind that pays significantly better than Mercer did. She almost laughed. That's not a very specific answer. No. He agreed. It's not, but it's an honest one. Would you be willing to meet? The sensible answer was no. The sensible answer was to hang up and call the number back, to verify it was real, and do some research and take at least 48 hours before agreeing to meet a stranger who had somehow learned she was unemployed approximately 14 hours after it happened. Wren had been sensible for 31 years. She had been careful and thorough, and she had checked her work twice, and she had never taken risks she couldn't quantify, and she was sitting on the floor of a Ossington apartment with $1,100 and a cat named Revenue and a manila envelope she still hadn't opened. Where? She said. The restaurant was on King Street West, the kind of place with no sign on the door and a hostess who looked at you like she was deciding whether you were worth the chair. Wren wore the best thing she owned. A charcoal blazer she'd bought on sale 2 years ago for a job interview she didn't get, and arrived 4 minutes early because she was constitutionally incapable of being late to anything. Vane was already there. She knew it was him before anyone told her. He was seated at a corner table with his back to the wall, deliberately. She would understand later, always deliberately, and he was reading something on his phone without looking up. And there was something about the way he occupied the space that made the rest of the restaurant feel like it was arranged around him. Not loud, not showy, just present in a way that most people weren't. He was older than she'd expected from the voice, mid-40s maybe. Dark hair going silver at the temples, a suit that cost more than Wren's monthly rent, possibly more than 3 months of it. There was a scar along his jaw, thin and old, the kind that had long since stopped trying to tell its story. He looked up when she was still 6 steps away, like he had already known she was there. Miss Halsey. He rose, actually stood up, which no one had done for Wren in so long she almost didn't know what to do with it, and extended his hand. Aldrich Vane. His handshake was exactly what she would have predicted. Firm, brief, communicating nothing, except that he had shaken a very large number of hands and had no feelings about it either way. "You knew I was there before I reached the table," she said, instead of hello. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile. "I make a habit of being aware of my surroundings." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please." She sat, he sat. A waiter appeared and was dispatched. Wren put her bag on the floor and her hands on the table and looked at him. "You said you had a position." "I do." "You didn't say what company you're with." "I'm not with a company. I run several." He said it the way other people said they owned a car. Informative, not impressive. "My primary concern at the moment is a set of holding structures that have become unnecessarily complicated. I need someone who can read a financial architecture and find where the weight is being distributed wrong." "That's what I do," Wren said. "I know. That's why I called you." She studied him. He looked back at her without particular expression, which was harder to read than hostility would have been. "How did you know I'd been let go? Mercer wouldn't have disclosed that." "No," he agreed. "They wouldn't." She waited. He didn't elaborate. "Mr. Vane." She kept her voice even. She was very good at keeping her voice even. "I'm going to need you to be clearer about what you're actually offering, and who you actually are, before this conversation continues." The not quite smile again. "Fair." He leaned back slightly. "I run a series of businesses in real estate, logistics, and private investment. Some of what I do is straightforward. Some of it is less so." He held her gaze. "I need someone who is very good with numbers, very good at discretion, and not frightened by complexity." "Less so how?" "The kind of complexity that doesn't get disclosed on a standard balance sheet." The table between them was very quiet. Wren was not stupid. She had been good at math since she was 8 years old, and she had understood, since she was about 22, that money, really understood, was a language that some people used to build things, and some people used to hide things, and that the line between those two uses was a great deal thinner than the people on Bay Street liked to admit. She had suspected for 2 years that some of what Mercer moved through its special client portfolios was not entirely clean, and she had kept that suspicion to herself because she needed her job and because she wasn't certain, and certainty mattered. She looked at Aldrich Vane and thought, "He is telling you exactly what this is, in the most deniable way possible, and waiting to see what you do with it." "What does it pay?" she said. Something shifted in his face. It was very small, the barest recalibration, like a door opening a centimeter, but she caught it, and she filed it. He named a number. Wren had been keeping her face neutral for a long time. She kept it neutral now, but underneath the table her left hand pressed flat against her knee. "Monthly," he added, "plus housing. I have a property that's currently unused. It would be simpler if you were on site. On site where?" "Here, Toronto. The property is in Rosedale." Of course it was. "I'd need to see the structures before I agree to anything," she said. "I'd need to understand what I'm actually being asked to do, specifically, and I'd need something in writing, naturally, and I'd need to know what happens if I see something I'm not comfortable with." He looked at her for a moment. "You'd tell me," he said, "and I'd decide whether to address it, and if I still weren't comfortable, then we'd negotiate. And if we couldn't reach an agreement, then you'd leave," he said simply, "with whatever you'd been paid and your full discretion intact. I don't hold people who want to leave. A pause. There's no value in it. It was, she thought, possibly the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a professional context in 4 years, which was either genuinely reassuring or deeply alarming, and she wasn't sure yet which. I need 24 hours, she said. Take them. She stood. He stood again, that same unhurried courtesy. She picked up her bag and looked at him one more time. How did you actually know about Mercer? She asked again. This time the not-quite smile went a fraction further. I know the managing partner, he said. He owes me a significant favor. When you left yesterday, he called to tell me the position had opened up. The managing partner. Wren thought about David Mercer, 63, silver-haired, the kind of man who went sailing in August, and called it recharging. She thought about the way he'd looked at her at the last Christmas party, like she was furniture that had somehow made it past the inventory check. And she thought about what it meant that a man like Aldrich Vane was owed favors by David Mercer. Thank you for lunch, she said, and left. She took the 24 hours. She spent them sitting at her kitchen table with revenue on the counter beside her laptop. His preferred position, the counter, regardless of what she had told him about it. And she went through everything she could find publicly on Aldrich Vane, which was not much. A name attached to a holding company. A name on a commercial real estate, filing from 2019. A photograph from a charity dinner in 2021 where he was standing at the edge of the frame, slightly turned away, like a man who knew exactly where the cameras were pointing and had positioned himself accordingly. What she found was less than she should have found for someone with that much money, which told her something. She made a list. She was always making lists. She made lists the way other people breathed, automatically, constantly, the only way she knew how to process the world. On the left side, reasons to say no. She filled half a page. On the right side, reasons to say yes. She wrote $1,100. She wrote Rosedale. She wrote he stood up when I walked in. She crossed that last one out. Then she looked at it for a while. Then she left it crossed out. In the morning she called the number and said yes. The Rosedale property was a house on a quiet street with a birch tree in the front yard that had somehow survived whatever winter had tried to do to it. The house was tall and old, and the kind of beautiful that comes from things being made well 100 years ago, and maintained because someone cared, not because someone was showing off. A woman named Tilda met her at the door. 50s, precise, the kind of efficient that makes you tired just watching it, and walked her through the rooms with the brisk neutrality of someone who had shown a lot of people a lot of rooms and had no opinion about any of them. The house had been used as a corporate property, Tilda explained, meeting space occasionally, guest quarters. It had been empty for 7 months. Wren's apartment in Ossington had one window that faced a brick wall. She moved in on Saturday. The work began Monday. Vane's offices were on Adelaide, which surprised her. She'd expected something more obscure, but the building was ordinary enough, glass and steel, and a lobby that could have belonged to a dozen different companies. His actual office was on the 14th floor, and it was nothing like she'd expected either. Sparse, ordered, a long table covered in printed documents, a window that looked north toward Bloor, and no decoration whatsoever except for a photograph on the credenza behind his desk that she wasn't close enough to make out. He was on the phone when she arrived. He ended the call without ceremony and came around the desk and put a drive on the table. Everything you need to start is here, he said. Holdings, structures, current accounts. The issue is in the way the logistics subsidiaries are nested. They're generating losses on paper that don't correspond to actual operational losses. I need to know where the discrepancy is and why. Wren picked up the drive. What do you think the reason is? I have a suspicion. I want to see if you find the same thing independently. She looked at him. You're testing me. I'm verifying, he said. There's a difference. She sat down at the long table and opened her laptop. He went back to his desk. For the next 4 hours, neither of them said anything except twice. Once when she asked him for a password to access a sub-account file, and once when he put a cup of coffee beside her without being asked, without saying anything about it, and she said thank you without looking up from the screen. By 2 in the afternoon she had found what she was looking for. The losses aren't operational, she said. They're structural. Someone nested a series of shell transactions through the Alberta subsidiary in 2022 and then again in early 2023. The money is moving, but it's moving in a circle. It goes out and comes back through a different name, and each time it does, it sheds about 3%, which accumulates in a separate account that isn't listed anywhere in the main structure. She paused. Someone is skimming. Has been for at least 2 years. Vane looked up from whatever he had been reading. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully name, something careful and attentive, and with a weight behind it that she felt rather than saw. How long did that take you? He said. 4 hours. He nodded, slowly. It took my previous person 6 weeks, and he never identified the separate account. Wren looked at the screen. Did you fire him? He resigned, Vane said. Before I had the chance. She absorbed that. Who set up the shell transactions? That, he said, is the question I'd like you to help me answer. She had been in the Rosedale house for 11 days when she found the photograph. She wasn't snooping. She had come back late from a meeting on Adelaide and had gone to the kitchen to make tea and had passed the small room off the main hallway that was used for storage. The door had been left open, which it normally wasn't, and on a shelf inside, leaning against a box, was a framed picture. 2 people. A woman, dark-haired, laughing at something off-camera in what looked like a park in summer, and beside her, unmistakably younger, the scar not yet on his jaw, a version of Aldrich Vane who was actually smiling. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went and made her tea and did not mention it. The next morning she was in the office at 7:30, which was earlier than usual, and Vane was already there, which no longer surprised her. He had a habit of arriving before anyone else, the same way he had a habit of sitting with his back to the wall and knowing where things were before he looked for them. She had started to catalogue his habits the way she catalogued everything else, not consciously exactly, but in the part of her brain that didn't know how to stop. She put the files from yesterday on the table, and he came over, and they stood side by side looking at her annotations, and she said, the person who set up the Alberta shells had internal access. It's not someone who hacked in from outside. They knew exactly how the structure was nested because they helped build it. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, you already knew that. I suspected it. Who built the structure originally? A pause. Not evasive. She'd learned to tell the difference. Just the pause of someone deciding how much to say. His name was Doran, Vane said. He's been with me for 9 years. He's currently in Vancouver. Wren looked at the papers. 9 years is a long time to suddenly start skimming. Yes, Vane said. It is. She thought about this. She thought about all the things you did for people over 9 years. The trust you built. The access you were given. The ways that access could start to look, over time, like something you were owed. She thought about David Mercer and the Christmas party. She thought about the junior analysts and their promotion lunches. What happens when you confirm it? She asked. Vane's voice, when he answered, had no particular inflection. Doran is called back from Vancouver. We have a conversation. He returns what he's taken, plus interest. And then he's finished. Finished how? Wren said. Vane looked at her. He leaves, he said, with whatever he hasn't stolen and a very clear understanding of what would happen if he ever discussed any of this with anyone. She held his gaze. Is that all that happens? The look he gave her was long and even. What are you asking, Miss Halsey? I'm asking if finished means something other than fired. Something moved through his face, not irritation, exactly, but a kind of weight, like someone picking up something they'd put down and hadn't wanted to pick back up again. He'll be fine, Vane said. He'll be unemployed and somewhat frightened and significantly poorer, but he'll be fine. She believed him. She wasn't entirely sure why. She'd believed people before and been wrong, but she believed him and she filed that too. She had been there 3 weeks when Vane asked her to stay late. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that, after everyone else had left the Adelaide office, and it was just the 2 of them in the long room with the north-facing window, and the printed document spread across the table, He put down the file he'd been reading and looked at her and said, "Tell me how you ended up at Mercer." She looked up. "Is that relevant to the Doran file?" "No." She put down her own pen. "Then why are you asking?" "Because I'm curious." He said it plainly, the way he said everything. Without performance, without softening, without any of the social wrapping that most people put around things that were personal. "You're very good at this. Better than people I've paid considerably more. I want to understand how you ended up somewhere that didn't notice that." Wren was quiet for a moment. She looked at the table. She thought about giving him the short version. The version she gave at job interviews. The one that made her sound like she was simply seeking new opportunities. And then she thought about the $1,100 and the birch tree in the front yard and the photograph in the storage room, and she gave him the real one. She told him about the degree from U of T that she'd done on scholarship while working 20 hours a week. She told him about the entry-level position she'd taken at Mercer because it was the only offer she got, and she didn't have the luxury of waiting for better. She told him about the 4 years, and the junior analysts and the quarterly reports, and the Christmas party and David Mercer's face, and she told him about Tuesday afternoon, and Barb with the manila envelope and 3 weeks severance, and the cold on Bay Street that went through her coat. She told it flatly, without drama, the way she'd trained herself to talk about things that had hurt her, and when she finished, Vane was quiet for a moment. "David Mercer," he said, "is not a good man." "I know," Wren said. "I mean that more specifically than it might sound." She looked at him. "How specifically?" "The favor he owed me," Vane said, "was not a small one, and the reason he owed it to me is something I'll tell you someday, when it's relevant. But I want you to know that when he called me about you, when he told me, I suspect with some satisfaction, that you'd been released, he didn't anticipate what I'd do with that information." Wren looked at him for a long time. The building was very quiet. Somewhere below them the city moved around in the way cities moved at night, indifferent and continuous. "You took the call," she said slowly, "and you thought, this is the person I've been looking for." "I thought," he said, "that Mercer had made a mistake, and that his mistakes occasionally become useful to me." She almost laughed. "Not quite. So I'm a mistake you're correcting. You're a resource he underestimated." A pause. "It happens. Does it happen to you?" He looked at her steadily. "Not twice," he said. The Doran situation resolved itself in a way Wren had not predicted, which was unusual, because she was very good at predicting things. Doran came back from Vancouver, called back as Vane had said he would be, and the meeting on Adelaide was quiet and short, and Vane came out of it with the account numbers Wren had identified and a transfer confirmation, and Doran left the building and did not come back. She heard all of this second-hand from Tilda, who had apparently been present for portions of it, and reported back to Wren with the same brisk neutrality with which she did everything else. What she hadn't predicted was Doran's reason. "His daughter," Tilda said, over coffee at the island in the Rosedale kitchen. "Medical bills. The child has been sick for 2 years. He didn't know how else to manage it." Wren sat with that for a moment. "Does Vane know?" she asked. "He knew before Doran came back," Tilda said. "He found out the same day you identified the account, and he still. Tilda set down her cup. "He's consistent, Aldrich. People sometimes confuse that for coldness." Wren didn't say anything. She thought about the photograph in the storage room. She thought about the coffee appearing beside her laptop without comment. She thought about a man who stood up when someone walked to his table, who told you exactly what he was, and waited to see what you did with it, who had looked at a woman being quietly disposed of by a man who owed him a favor, and had thought, "I'll take her." She thought about all the ways you could be consistent. She was in the Adelaide office 3 weeks later when Vane came in later than usual. She knew his schedule now, could track his movements by small disturbances in the ambient order of things. A habit she found mildly alarming in herself, and he sat down at the table across from her and put a new file in front of her and said, "I have another situation. The Vancouver holdings?" she guessed. "No." He paused. "This one is personal." She looked up. He was looking at the window, not at her, which was unusual for him. He looked at things directly, always. The fact that he wasn't was itself information. "My sister," he said. "She's been managing a property trust for the past 4 years. Small family assets, nothing significant in the context of the other holdings. But she's stopped sending statements. She won't return calls. And her business partner, a man named Croft, someone she brought in about 18 months ago, has been responding to correspondence on her behalf." Wren said nothing. She waited. "I need to know," Vane said, "what's actually in that trust, and whether she's in there of her own accord." The way he said it, the last sentence, specifically, was the first time Wren had heard something in his voice that wasn't controlled. "You think Croft is—" "I don't know what I think," he said. "That's why I'm telling you." She looked at the file. Then she looked at him. He was still facing the window, and in the early morning light coming through the glass, his face had a tiredness in it she hadn't seen before, something that had nothing to do with sleep. "I'll start today," she said. He looked at her then, just briefly. "Thank you, Wren," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She looked back down at the file before anything showed on her face. The trust took her 6 days to unpick, and what she found was worse than Vane had suspected, and better than the worst case she had privately mapped out. Croft had been redirecting the income distributions from the property trust. Not the principal, not yet, but the quarterly distributions, diverting them through a numbered company in New Brunswick and pooling them in an account attached to nothing Wren could link to Vane's sister. The sister, her name was Ines. Wren learned from the documents. Ines Vane, 2 years younger than Aldrich, had signed several authorization letters over the past 8 months, all in the same period, all in ink that looked slightly different from her earlier signatures, slightly less certain, like someone writing with a hand that wasn't sure. Wren brought it to Vane on a Friday. She laid it out the way she laid everything out, methodically, in the order that made the most sense, without editorializing. The numbers, the redirected distributions, the numbered company, the letters and what her signatures told her. She put it all on the table and walked him through it, and when she was done, she stopped talking and waited. He sat very still. "Where is she?" he said, not to Wren, to the room. "The property trust correspondence lists a Collingwood address," Wren said carefully. "But based on the letter dates and when Croft started responding on her behalf, I'd estimate she's been isolated from the business decisions for at least 5 months. He stood up and walked to the window. His back was to her, and his hands were at his sides, and she watched him breathe. Once, twice, the particular calibrated breathing of a man who made decisions instead of having feelings in places where feelings could be observed. Then he turned around. "I need to go to Collingwood," he said. "Yes, I'd like you to come." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because if there are documents involved, and there will be documents, I want someone there who can look at them in the moment and tell me what I'm looking at." It was a practical reason. She was fairly certain it was not the only one, and she was equally certain he knew she knew that, and neither of them said so. "When?" she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "Early." They drove up on a Saturday morning when the highway was still thin with traffic, and the land north of the city opened up into the particular grey-white of an Ontario winter that had almost finished with itself, the fields scraped clean, and the tree lines along the horizon looking like something penciled in. They didn't talk much. This was not uncomfortable. Wren had learned that Vane's silences were not the kind that needed filling. They were just pauses in which he was thinking, and thinking was something he apparently did without needing an audience. She watched the highway and drank the coffee she'd brought and thought about the numbered company in New Brunswick and what Croft had thought he was doing. She thought about people who watched someone else working something they'd built and decided, slowly, that they'd earned the right to take from it. She thought about all the forms that kind of reasoning could take: the junior analysts, the Christmas party, Doran and his daughter, Croft, and whatever it was he wanted. She thought about the particular shape of resentment that came from being close to something valuable and deciding the proximity was the same as a claim. "You're thinking." She glanced at him. He was watching the road. "I'm always thinking. About Croft. About why people do it, she said. Take from people who trusted them. He was quiet for a moment. Some people feel entitled to what they're near, he said. Some people are desperate. Some people are both. A pause. Croft is the first kind, and Doran was the second. Yes. She looked out the window. Does it make a difference? To how you handle it? Yes, he said simply. It does. She thought about that for the rest of the drive. The Collingwood house was on the edge of town, back from the road, a century home with a deep porch and a front yard that had been let go slightly. Not badly, not neglectfully, but in the way that things go when someone's attention has been elsewhere. There was a car in the drive that Wren didn't recognize, and the curtains in the front window moved before they'd even gotten out of the car. Vane stopped on the front walk. "Let me go first," he said. She stayed at the car. He went up the porch steps and knocked, and there was a long pause, and then the door opened and Wren was too far away to hear what was said. But she saw the woman in the doorway, dark-haired, the same bone structure as Aldrich, a face that had recently been doing something difficult. And she saw Vane's shoulders drop just slightly, the smallest change in the set of them, and she understood that whatever he'd been afraid of finding, he hadn't found it. She was okay. Ines was okay, scared and isolated and extracting herself from something that had gotten much larger than she'd understood when she'd agreed to it. But okay, Croft was not there. He had, apparently, been gone since Thursday. A fact that told Wren he'd known something was coming, which told her something about how good Vane's people were, because someone had moved and Croft had felt it. She spent 2 hours at the kitchen table in Collingwood with a box of documents that Ines had been quietly collecting for 3 months. Ines, it turned out, who had not been entirely passive in this, who had been building a record while pretending to be compliant, who had her brother's habit of watching and waiting and knowing exactly what she was looking at. "I didn't want to call him," Ines said when Wren asked why she hadn't reached out to Aldrich sooner. She said it quietly, looking at her hands. "He has enough to carry. I thought I could fix it myself." Wren looked at the woman across the table, the careful handwriting on the documents, the organized box, the 5 months of patience and precision, and thought, "You are very much his sister." "You mostly did," Wren said. "I just found the numbers you couldn't get to." Ines looked at her. "He trusts you," she said. "He doesn't do that easily." Wren didn't say anything. She looked at the document in her hands and thought about what it meant to be trusted by a man who had learned to trust the way you learned to walk on something that had given way before, carefully, with your weight distributed, knowing exactly where the solid ground was. She thought about the drive up and the highway and the silence that didn't need filling. She thought about the first day on Adelaide, the coffee appearing beside her without comment, and the way he'd said her name on a Friday morning like it was something he'd decided to do. She was not a person who made decisions quickly. She had learned that about herself a long time ago, the same way she'd learned that numbers didn't lie, and that people who stood up when you walked into a room were telling you something, whether they meant to or not. She put the document back in the box and picked up the next one. She had a lot of work still to do, but for the first time in a very long time, sitting in a kitchen in Collingwood in February with revenue waiting at home, and a birch tree in a front yard in Rosedale, and a man standing in the hallway with his sister and his shoulders finally level. For the first time in a long time, Wren Halsey thought, "I am exactly where I am supposed to be." She wasn't sure yet what to do with that, but she was at least keeping it.